In a world drowning in noise where the mind races from past regrets to future fears, one silent truth has the power to awaken your soul. The power of now isn't just a book. It's a doorway to inner peace, clarity, and a life fully lived. What if the present moment is all you ever needed? This is Thinknova, where ideas spark transformation, and you're about to discover the moment that changes everything. Right now. In the quiet of early morning, when the world still seemed to be wrapped in sleep, a man sat in the stillness of his living room, grappling with a silent battle that raged inside his mind. For years, he had lived under a fog of anxiety, depression, and the ceaseless chatter of thoughts that echoed relentlessly through his consciousness. Every tick of the clock seemed to echo his dread, and every breath felt like a borrowed one. His mind had become a prison, and he could find no exit. He had spent countless hours trying to make sense of his suffering. Therapy, books, advice from friends, all seemed like temporary bandages over a wound that refused to heal. He would lie awake through long nights, his thoughts circling like vultures around regrets of the past and fears of the future. The present moment felt elusive, almost irrelevant, as he lived in a constant mental projection. One night, pushed to the brink of despair, he sat on the edge of his bed, paralyzed by the weight of his mind. A voice within him screamed silently. He could no longer live with himself. And in that moment, something shifted. That very thought echoed in his consciousness, repeating, "I can't live with myself." Who then was this I, and who was the self he could no longer tolerate? In that fragment of realization, he saw a space open within him, a detachment from the voice that had ruled his life. For the first time, he became aware of the presence behind the thoughts. It was not just the mind speaking. There was also the one who was witnessing the mind, and that awareness changed everything. From that day forward, his life would never be the same. The man would come to be known as Eckhart Tolle, and he would step into a journey that would not be about gaining knowledge, but about shedding illusions. He would come to realize that the key to inner peace, freedom, and truth was not hidden in some distant future or philosophical abstraction, but right here, in this very moment. The transformation was not dramatic in appearance, but it was seismic in experience. Where there had once been turbulence, now there was clarity. Where once lived fear, now there was stillness. He began to understand that the core of human suffering stems not from external events, but from identification with the mind, with thoughts, emotions, judgments, and stories that arise like clouds in the sky, but are mistaken for reality. He observed that most people live in a state of continuous inner resistance to what is. They dwell on what was or obsess over what might be. They replay past mistakes, missed opportunities, heartbreaks, and regrets, or they project themselves forward into imagined futures filled with hope or fear. Rarely, if ever, do they inhabit the present moment, and yet, the present is all there ever is. As Eckhart continued his journey, he came to realize that time, as the mind perceives it, is largely a mental construct. Clock time has practical value, but psychological time is the source of suffering. It is the story the mind tells about me in relation to past and future. This identity, this ego, is rooted in time. It cannot survive in the now because the now has no storyline. People think they are their thoughts, but they are not. Thoughts come and go, but there is a presence behind the thoughts, a still awareness that does not change. This awareness is the true self, not the labels, roles, or memories that the mind uses to construct identity. Eckhart began to notice how even simple experiences held deep power when approached from presence. A flower, a breeze, the warmth of the sun, all became gateways to being. When fully present, there was no need to name, judge, or interpret. There was just the direct experience of now. He realized that enlightenment is not something to be attained in the future. It is simply the realization of being now. Stillness, he learned, is not the absence of movement, but the presence of inner space. This space is where peace lives. In the stillness, the incessant voice of the mind begins to fade. Without the mind's grip, fear dissolves, because fear is always linked to time, to what might happen, or what has happened. In observing others, he saw how pain was often self-inflicted through resistance. When someone cuts you off in traffic, and you replay it mentally for hours, it is not the event that causes your suffering, but your refusal to accept it. Acceptance does not mean you approve, but it allows you to stop fighting with what is. He noticed that even people in comfortable lives were deeply unhappy because they lived in their minds. Success, possessions, and relationships could not fill the inner void. That void was not a lack of things, but a lack of presence. People were disconnected from themselves and the source of life itself. They lived as though life was a series of obstacles to overcome, rather than a flow to be entered. One afternoon, Eckhart sat by a lake, watching the still surface reflect the sky. As clouds moved across, he thought about the mind in similar terms. Thoughts are like clouds. They come, they go, and they change shape. But the sky, the space in which they arise, remains untouched. In the same way, consciousness is the vast field in which all thoughts and feelings appear and disappear. We are not the clouds. We are the sky. He also began to understand the power of surrender, not as defeat, but as alignment. When we stop resisting the present moment, we stop generating suffering. Surrender brings us into harmony with life. It dissolves the ego's narrative and opens us to the intelligence of the universe. It doesn't mean passive resignation, but flowing with life instead of fighting it. Pain, he realized, is inevitable in life, but suffering is optional. Pain happens in the now, a cut, a loss, a failure. But suffering arises when we add a mental story to the pain. We say, this shouldn't have happened, or this always happens to me. And the mind magnifies the pain into a narrative of self-pity or resentment. But when pain is allowed to be, without mental resistance, it passes through like a wave. As Eckhart deepened his practice, he came to see that most people carry a pain body, an accumulation of old emotional pain that lives in the energy field of the body. This pain body gets triggered by present events and seeks to feed itself by creating more pain. Arguments, drama, emotional outbursts, these are often the pain body acting out. The more unconscious a person is, the more the pain body controls their behavior.
But the pain body cannot survive the light of awareness. When you observe it, without judgment, without identifying with it, you begin to disidentify. You are no longer saying, I am angry, but rather, there is anger in me. That small shift opens the door to liberation. Eckhart often sat quietly, doing nothing, simply observing. He watched the breath go in and out. He listened to the sounds around him. He noticed the sensations in his hands. These were not techniques, but doorways to presence. When the mind was quiet, life unfolded with grace. There was no need to strive, to prove, to chase. There was only being. He discovered that true intelligence emerges not from thinking, but from stillness. In stillness, there is access to creativity, wisdom, and right action. Thinking has its place for solving practical problems, but the compulsive stream of thoughts that most people live with is not true thinking. It is noise. He came to see that emotions are also rooted in thoughts. A negative emotion is a signal that the mind is telling a story that is out of alignment with truth. If you feel fear, anger, or sadness, you can trace it back to a thought, a judgment, an expectation, a resistance. But when you bring presence to the emotion without feeding it with thought, it dissolves. The body became an anchor to the now. Attention to the inner body, the subtle energy field within, brought an immediate sense of aliveness and peace. This inner body, always present, cannot be perceived by thought, only felt. It is a doorway to the unmanifested, the formless source of all life. Eckhart no longer lived through labels. A tree was not just a tree, but a living form arising from the same source as himself. A person was not defined by their name, role, or behavior, but was a field of consciousness temporarily taking shape. Judgment began to fall away, replaced by compassion. He learned to let go of the need to know, the need to control, the need to be right. These were all products of ego. The ego thrives on separation, comparison, and identification. But the true self has no need to defend or assert. It simply is. The journey was not about becoming something new, but remembering who he had always been, a timeless, formless presence in which life dances. As the days passed, The man who once lived in the shadow of his mind now walked lightly through the world as if a burden had been lifted from his soul. There was no drama in his presence, no need to impress, no striving to become. There was only awareness, calm, still, and deeply alive. He did not retreat from the world but began to see the world through new eyes. Each moment he observed was complete in itself. There was no need to rush toward some imagined future, no hunger for more than what was already here. Whether walking through a crowded street or sitting alone beneath a tree, he found the same richness, the aliveness of now. The content of the moment might change, but its essence remained the same. It was life expressing itself. People he encountered began to notice something in him. A peace that didn't come from words, a stillness that wasn't dependent on circumstance. Some asked questions, others simply sat with him, as if something within them recognized the stillness in him and longed to remember their own. He did not teach by concept, but by presence. He noticed how much of human interaction was rooted in unconsciousness. In conversations, people often did not listen. They waited for their turn to speak. They were not truly present with each other, but instead engaged in mental rehearsals, judgments, or comparisons. This created separation, not connection. But when he listened, truly listened, without mental commentary or agenda, something powerful happened. The other person felt seen, not their story, not their role, but their essence. Presence became a gift he offered not through effort, but through being. In that space, healing happened. He came to understand that relationships could be portals to awakening, or they could be battlegrounds for the ego. In most relationships, people unconsciously use each other to complete their own sense of self. They seek validation, security, or identity through the other. But such relationships are bound to create conflict because no one can fulfill the inner void created by disconnection from being. When both people are unconscious, the relationship becomes a cycle of blame, expectation, and pain. Each sees the other not as they are, but as a projection of their own unmet needs. But when one person becomes present, the dynamic shifts. There is no longer a need to be right, to control, to defend. There is space for acceptance. Acceptance does not mean allowing abuse or dysfunction. It means meeting the moment without resistance. From that space, wise action can emerge. Presence brings clarity, not from logic, but from inner alignment. He noticed how people feared stillness. They filled every gap with noise, music, screens, conversation. Silence made them uncomfortable, because in silence, the mind loses its grip. In silence, the unresolved emotions, the restless energy, the suppressed fear, all begin to surface. But rather than facing it, they escaped. Yet silence is not the enemy. It is the doorway. When you sit in silence and observe, you begin to see the patterns of the mind. You begin to notice how thoughts arise, how emotions follow, how reactions form. You realize that you are not these movements. You are the awareness in which they unfold. Awareness does not judge. It simply watches. One evening, Eckhart walked through a park, watching the golden light of sunset filter through the trees. A breeze moved gently through the leaves, and children's laughter rang in the distance. Everything was alive, and yet still. There was no commentary in his mind, no evaluation, no labeling. Only the moment, complete and perfect in itself. He remembered how, years ago, such a moment would have gone unnoticed. The mind would have been lost in thought, reliving a conversation or planning the next task. But now, there was nothing to add, nothing to take away. Presence had become natural. He began to speak more about the pain body, how emotional pain from the past accumulates and lives in the body like a residue. This pain body feeds on negative thoughts and reactions. It thrives on drama, conflict, and resentment. It wants to be right. It wants to be offended. It wants to suffer. because suffering reinforces the story of me.
But when you become aware of the pain body as it arises, you break the identification. You no longer say, "I am sad," but rather, "Sadness is here." This shift allows you to hold space for the emotion without being consumed by it. And in that space, the emotion begins to dissolve. Some emotions, he found, were deeply rooted. They might rise again and again, but each time they were met with awareness, their grip weakened. The light of presence slowly burns away the residue of the past. He also explored the concept of the inner body, the felt sense of aliveness within. By placing attention on the inner body, you withdraw energy from the mind and return to the now. Feeling the inner body grounds you in the present and opens the door to intuition and wisdom. The mind, he taught, is not to be rejected. It is a useful tool, a beautiful servant, but a dangerous master. When used consciously, it can create great beauty and innovation, but when it takes control, it creates illusion, separation, and suffering. Most people are not thinking, they are being thought by the mind. To be free, you must learn to step back and observe the mind, not to fight it, but to watch it with curiosity, like watching a river flow. In that observation, you create space. And in that space, the mind loses its control. He noticed how the ego feeds on time. It lives in the past, who you were, what happened, what you lost. Or it projects into the future, what you want, what you fear, what you expect. But it cannot exist in the now because the now has no psychological story. It just is. When you bring your attention fully into the present, the ego fades. In the now, there is no past to regret and no future to fear. There is only life happening. The body feels lighter. The mind becomes still. The heart opens. Eckhart often used the breath as an anchor to presence. Each inhale and exhale was a reminder. You are here, not in yesterday, not in tomorrow, but here, now. He found that when people focused on the breath, they began to feel peace. Not because the breath has magical properties, but because attention had returned to the present. He observed how people define themselves by external things: job, appearance, possessions, opinions. But all these things are unstable. They change. And when they change, people suffer because they believe something essential was lost. But the true self is not found in form. It is formless, timeless, untouched by external change. Even spiritual identity, he warned, can become ego. People begin to think of themselves as spiritual and unconsciously compare, judge, or feel superior. But true spirituality has no labels. It is not about belief, but about presence. He emphasized the power of now not as a concept, but as an experience. You cannot understand the now with the mind. You must enter it. And once you do, you realize it was always here, waiting beneath the noise. Sometimes people asked him how to stay present when faced with challenges: illness, loss, injustice. He would remind them that pain is part of life, but suffering arises from resistance. When you face pain with presence, it becomes a portal to awakening. Even in grief, there can be a quiet peace beneath the waves. He spoke about surrender, not as giving up, but as letting go of inner resistance. Surrender is saying yes to the moment, even when it's difficult. It's trusting that life has intelligence, even when the mind doesn't understand. In surrender, there is freedom. One morning, as the rain fell softly outside, Eckhart sat by the window, watching droplets gather and slide down the glass. Each drop was unique, yet part of the whole, just like each moment, distinct, yet arising from the same source. He thought about how people often chase fulfillment through achievement or acquisition. But even when they get what they want, the satisfaction is short-lived. Why? Because they are trying to fill an inner void with outer form. True fulfillment comes not from getting something, but from being present with what is.
Presence brings gratitude, not as a practice, but as a natural state. When you are truly present, you feel grateful. Not because of what you have, but because you are here, alive, breathing, awake. He noticed that even nature reflects presence. Animals, trees, rivers, they do not live in time. They simply are. They do not struggle to become. They live in harmony with the flow of life. That is why people feel peace in nature, because nature does not judge, compare, or pretend. It simply exists. He began to see that suffering, in a strange way, serves a purpose. It awakens. When the pain becomes too great, it forces you to question, to seek, to let go. Many people begin their spiritual journey not through joy, but through despair. But once awakened, they realize the pain was a teacher. He often sat in stillness with others, saying very little. Words were not always necessary. Presence itself communicated. Some felt a deep peace in his presence, not because he gave them answers, but because he reminded them of something they already knew, the stillness within. He taught that the present moment is the most precious thing there is, not because it contains something extraordinary, but because it is the only place where life actually happens. The past is memory. The future is imagination. Only the now is real. In the midst of daily life, amid the noise and movement of modern civilization, Eckhart found that the practice of presence did not require retreating from the world. It required only a shift in awareness. Washing dishes, waiting at a red light, standing in line at a store. Each of these moments could become a doorway into the now. They were not obstacles on the way to life. They were life. He noticed how often people lived as if the present moment were something to get through, a means to an end. They were always waiting for the next thing, the end of the workday, the weekend, the vacation, the promotion, the relationship, the better version of life they imagined. But in this waiting, they were missing life itself. They were postponing living. He began to point out that there are 3 types of unconscious time: clock time, psychological time, and waiting. Clock time, used wisely, helps us function. But psychological time creates suffering. It's when we use the past for identity and the future for salvation. And waiting is the mindset of postponement, the idea that fulfillment is just around the corner. But nothing ever happens outside the now. Life cannot be lived in the past or future. Only in this moment does anything real occur. He encouraged others to become aware of how much of their lives were spent in a state of inner resistance. Even mundane moments, traffic jams, spilled coffee, missed emails, became sources of irritation because of the mental judgment added to them. The mind said, "This should not be happening," and in that judgment, stress arose. But what if, he asked, you removed the mental resistance? What if you accepted the moment as it is, without the added story? Suddenly, the moment became manageable, even peaceful. It was not the event, but the inner refusal that caused suffering. He often spoke of the 3 ways to align with the present moment: acceptance, enjoyment, and enthusiasm. If you cannot enjoy or be enthusiastic about what you are doing, at least accept it. Acceptance brings you into alignment with the now, and from there, new possibilities can arise. Eckhart began to travel and speak, sharing his insights not as doctrines, but as invitations. He reminded people that awakening is not something to be achieved in some distant future. It is already here, beneath the layers of thought and story. He watched how people were addicted to thinking, how they used the mind constantly, compulsively, often without even knowing it. But just as the body needs rest, the mind needs stillness. In silence, the deepest intelligence can be felt. Many asked him about goals and ambition. Wasn't it necessary to think of the future, to plan and achieve? He clarified that practical planning is useful and rooted in presence. But psychological attachment to the future creates tension. When action arises from the now, not from fear, lack, or need, it carries power. You can plan from presence. You can act without losing the stillness within. He pointed to the difference between doing and being. In the modern world, people often define themselves by what they do. But who you are is not your job, your achievements, or your status. Those are roles. Beneath them is being, the unchanging presence that you truly are. When being infuses doing, action becomes graceful. It flows. It is not driven by ego or fear. It becomes aligned with life. One day, while walking by a river, Eckhart observed the current as it moved over rocks and around bends. It did not force, it flowed. That, he thought, is how life moves when we stop resisting. The river did not argue with the rock. It found its way around. He began to teach that suffering has a function. It shows you where you are still unconscious. It reveals where you are identified with the mind, the ego, or the pain body. It is a signal that you are out of alignment with the now. And in that awareness, the healing begins. He often invited people to die before you die. Not a physical death, but a death of the false self. The ego, the narrative self, must dissolve so that the true self can emerge. This death is not loss, but liberation. What dies is the illusion. What remains is real. As he sat in quiet gatherings, people would ask questions, share struggles, seek clarity. He did not offer advice in the traditional sense. Instead, he pointed them back to the now. Over and over, he reminded them, the answer is not in thought. It is in awareness. He noticed how much of human fear is based on imagined futures. The mind creates scenarios of failure, loss, rejection, and the body reacts as if those things are already happening. But they are not. They are thought forms. And when you bring your attention to the present, the fear dissolves. Even physical pain, he observed, could be met with awareness. Pain resisted becomes suffering. Pain accepted becomes sensation. When you bring your attention fully to the area of pain, without mental story, you often find it changes, lessens, or reveals something deeper. Awareness heals. He emphasized that you are not the content of your life. You are the space in which the content appears. Your thoughts, emotions, circumstances, these are the waves on the surface. But you are the ocean. And just as the ocean is not disturbed by surface ripples, your essence remains undisturbed by external change. He taught that spiritual practice is not about becoming someone else. It is about removing what you are not. The masks, the roles, the false identities, these fall away when you become present. What remains is who you truly are. Many asked him about forgiveness, how to let go of past hurts. He explained that forgiveness is not something you do. It is something that arises when you no longer dwell in time. When you are present, the past loses its grip. You do not need to forgive. There is nothing left to forgive. He saw that people carry grievances like stones in a bag. Every time they remember an offense, they pick up the stone again, relive the pain, and reinforce the identity of the victim. But when they drop the story, the weight falls away. One evening, as twilight filled the sky, Eckhart sat quietly, watching the first stars appear. He felt the vastness of being, not as an idea, but as a lived experience. There was no boundary between him and the world. There was only presence. He began to speak of death, not morbidly, but as a reminder of impermanence. Everything in form is temporary. The body will pass. Circumstances will change. But what you are, pure consciousness, does not die. The fear of death arises from identifying with the form. When you realize you are formless, the fear dissolves. In the face of death, people often awaken. The petty concerns of the ego fall away. What matters becomes clear. Presence deepens. And sometimes, in the presence of great loss, people touch the stillness within, because the noise has fallen silent. He encouraged people to use every moment as a teacher. Traffic, illness, heartbreak, boredom, all could become entry points into presence. Life itself was the greatest teacher, not because of what it gave or took away, but because of how it pointed you back to yourself. In daily life, he suggested, create gaps, small spaces of no thought, between breaths, between actions, between words, feel the stillness. These gaps widen the space within, and in that space, presence deepens. He reminded people that presence is not a technique, it is a state of being. You don't need to add anything, you only need to subtract what obscures it: thought, resistance, judgment.